This is Isabelle. She has a rewarding job at an indie bookstore where she meets famous authors.
Guess who I called the other day? Picked up the phone and called on his private number, Isaac Singer.
And she's got her eye on Anton Moss,
the writer,
though he can't seem to reciprocate her feelings.
If anyone's being manipulated, it's me!
Her grandmother, on the other hand, has other plans.
If I'll wait for you, you'll never do it.
What are you talking about?
And she invites a matchmaker to help set Isabelle up.
You made an appointment with a marriage broker?
And the matchmaker sets up a meeting with Sam.
I think I met someone. It was an arranged meeting with a marriage broker. My grandmother set it up.
You're joking.
Although initially, Isabelle can't see past the old-fashioned marriage system from the shtetl.
It's been lovely meeting you, Sam, and I appreciate your kind invitation, but I don't think I want to go.
Sam, the pickle guy, hopes to win her over.
I was so happy I was going to see you tonight. I made a special brucha for the occasion.
In this episode of Yiddishe Kino Club, we're looking at the 1988 movie Crossing Delancey to answer the question, is it possible to find love in unexpected places? Hi, if you're new here, my name is David, and here on Yiddishkeit, we talk about the experience of Jewishness. For me, that looks like looking at stories from Jewish history, culture, and art. And this movie, Crossing Delancey, captures so much of the Jewishness of the Lower East Side from the 1980s and referring back all the way to the early 20th century, as well as dealing with the themes of love and marriage. And so in this episode, I want to go through the background of how this movie was made. I want to dive into some of the history in this movie, particularly around pickles. And I want to end off talking about the theme of love from the matchmaker to modern romance. The story begins with Susan Sandler, who is a Jewish writer that wrote a play called Crossing Delancey about a young woman who comes to visit her bubby in her apartment in the Lower East Side, and it premiered off-Broadway at the Jewish Repertory Theater in 1985. The character of the bubby in the play was largely based off Sandler's own grandmother and Sandler's own experience of traveling to the Lower East Side to visit her. And so Joan Micklin Silver, who had directed several indie movies up until that point, including one of my favorite movies of all time called Hester Street, wanted to adapt this play for the screen. And so Joan Micklin Silver develops a screenplay together with Susan Sandler that focuses more on Isabelle's story, and in fact they end up filming in Susan Sandler's grandmother's apartment for this movie. When it came to the characters, Joan Micklin Silver knew that she wanted to cast Amy Irving to play Isabelle, who had previously starred opposite Barbara Streisand and Mandy Patinkin in the movie Yentl, which also deals with Jewish themes, just 5 years before that in 1983.
I was in Jerez, Spain, being a location wife on the film Empire of the Sun that my then husband Steven Spielberg was directing. And then Joan Micklin Silver calls me. I don't know this woman, but she says, "Can I come to Jerez, Spain? I have something for you." My savior. She brought me this beautiful script, Crossing Delancey, and I read it. Stephen and I read it. We both loved it. Stephen gave it to Steve Ross, who was the head of Warner Brothers, and he loved it, and off and running.
And to play Sam, she cast Peter Riegert, who she previously worked with on another movie.
But I had already worked with Joan on a movie called Chilly Scenes of Winter. So we'd known each other. And I do remember Susan writing me a postcard saying, "I'm sorry you can't do the play, but maybe you'll do the movie."
And Isabelle's other love interest is played by a Dutch actor named Jeroen Krabbe, and he actually stars in several English movies, including one of my favorite movies of all time, where he plays the Hasidic father in the movie Left Luggage from 1998, which also deals with Jewish themes. The hardest role to cast for this movie was that of the bubby. Now, Joan Micklin Silver wanted to cast a woman named Razel Bojik, who was a big star of the Yiddish theater. At the beginning of the 20th century, when there were millions of Jews living in this neighborhood of the Lower East Side, there was a thriving Yiddish theater scene, which had some religious themes in the stories, but was mostly secular. Some of that has actually been preserved to this day in the form of Yiddish cinema, where a lot of the people who made those movies actually came from the world of Yiddish theater, and also a lot of them ended up influencing early Hollywood. But after World War II, the world of Yiddish theater began to decline as it evolved into other forms of of entertainment. And so in those years, the Yiddish theater was maintained by people like Razel and her husband Max Buzik.
And we were so lucky to find her. And we looked all over for my bubby, and she was the last person to walk in our door, and we had to yank her to come through the door because, you know, she's a big star of the Yiddish theater and had never auditioned for anything in her life, had never acted in English before, never been in a movie before.
I was afraid. I was very much afraid. Not of my work, of what will people think of me, of the language. I never played in English, never in English, always in Yiddish, all my life. I'm speaking the language of the country because I love it so much. But to perform in English, I couldn't even think of it.
Somehow we coaxed her into coming into the office, and the moment we met, it was like love at first sight. It was like, this is my bubby, and she will be for the rest of my life.
One of the elements that is really important to me, especially as a history nerd, that isn't exactly a character in this movie, but rather is the location, which is the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The Lower East Side became a Jewish neighborhood in the early 1800s when immigrants from Germany would come over to America, many of whom were Jewish, and settled in that area. At the time, it was known as Klein Deutschland, which means Little Germany, similar to how there's a neighborhood called Little Italy just nearby. However, by the end of the 19th century, many of these immigrants had become more prosperous and had moved either uptown or away. A very famous example of this is a man named Levi Strauss, who was a Jewish immigrant from Germany to America, moved to the Lower East Side, lived there for a bit, but eventually moved out to San Francisco, where he started the famous company which bears his name that sells denim clothing. Starting in the 1880s, a new wave of Jewish immigration would start, this time from the shtetls of the Russian Empire. And by 1920, there was over 2 million Jewish people living in this neighborhood, so much so that it became known as the Jewish Ghetto. And this was actually captured in Joe Silver's other film called Hester Street, which takes place 90 years before this one in 1898. At the height of the old Jewish neighborhood. This neighborhood was the birthplace of so much of what we consider American culture today, but is in fact Jewish in origin, like bagels, delis, of course pickles, which we'll talk about in a moment, and Yiddish words, slang, humor, so much of which is captured in this film.
You want to catch the wild monkey? You got to climb the tree. Verstehst? Sei gesund.
Chili-bum, chili-bum, bim-bum-bum, trinken, gießen wieder. Chili-bum, chili-bum, bim-bum-bum.
However, the children of those initial immigrants began to move away to other places like Brooklyn, Long Island, and Florida. Like Isabelle's parents also moved to Florida, and she herself has moved uptown. It's the older generation that lives in the big apartment complexes that is there to witness this demographic shift, which we can also see in the movie.
You didn't know your Bobby speaks Korean.
The main element of the Lower East Side that is captured in this movie is, of course, the old-fashioned pickle shop. There was a time at the height of this neighborhood where there was 80 pickle shops just on Essex Street. That is double the amount of pickle shops in the rest of the city combined. And so Sam inherited his pickle shop from his late father. And in fact, in the movie, they use a real life pickle shop called Gus's Pickles at their former location on Essex Street. And if you look at photos of that location of Gus's Pickles from that time, you can see how similar it looks in this movie. Like, it really preserved every single detail down to the signage and to the people gather around the barrel sampling the goods. During the height of the Jewish neighborhood, Essex Street was known as Pickle Alley because of how many pickle stores there were, but by the time they made this movie, Gus's Pickles was one of the last shops in the neighborhood.
I had worked on the Lower East Side, so I knew of this particular place where we worked, which is called Gus's Pickles. So my research was based mostly on eating pickles.
Today, the last remaining old-fashioned pickle store on the Lower East Side is called the Pickle Guys. It was actually captured in a movie called The Cobbler with Adam Sandler from 2014, but it was actually at their former location on Essex Street. Today, they have a store on the corner of Grand Street. And there was also another movie in 2020 called American Pickle with Seth Rogen, which also focused on the theme of pickles, where immigrant from the shtetl comes to the Lower East Side, gets a job in a pickle factory where he then accidentally falls into a giant vat of pickles and gets brined for 100 years and then wakes up 100 years later to meet his great-grandson. It may seem like the fact that Sam is a pickle guy is just a minor detail in the story, but let me assure you it's not. It is loaded with so much history, but also it informs us into Sam's character that he's deeply rooted in the cultural tradition of the Lower East Side. But it's also what inspired Susan Sandler to create this play to begin with.
The origin of the story began with a poem that I wrote in high school. There was a pickle lady who lived in the building that my bubby lived in, and she was the inspiration for the story. And this is called Ode to the Pickle Lady. It goes, "Oh, Madam of the Dills, Lady of the Kosher Sours and Sweets, your cry echoes through the streets of Essex and Broome, where it is caught on the cuffs of a child of 10, barely visible through the layers of well-earned dirt. Head bent back, craning to see the face of his ma, he screams up to the 5th floor window of a tenement apartment. Hey, ma, ma, throw down a nickel for a pickle. Hey, ma, ma. Oh, Madam of the Dills, Lady of the Kosher Sours and Sweets, around your stall gather the elite of the block. Seated on barrels, they chew over recently thought thoughts, recently attended funerals and brisses, and recently dreamt dreams, yet unfulfilled." So that was the germ of the idea that launched the story.
So let's get to the story itself, which follows Isabelle, who works at a bookstore where she hosts events to promote different authors and attends these soirees. When we first see her in the movie, we see how she's working at one of these events where she keeps on looking over to one man, a writer named Anton Moss. The thing is that Anton isn't really into Isabelle in that way, he more just sees her as someone that he can use. And we see this in the opening of the movie where Isabelle and Anton lock eyes, he beckons her to come over to him from across the room, only then to give her his cup, which he was finished with. And this becomes very emblematic of their entire dynamic throughout this movie. For example, when Isabelle asks him to lunch, he invites another woman along, and when he finally shows some romantic interest in her, it's only to lure her in to become his new assistant. However, Isabelle keeps putting up with all of this, partly because she wants the prestige that comes along with dating someone who is so famous and sophisticated.
Actually, I am seeing someone. Oh? You know Anton Moss? The writer?
But there's also this hope that Isabelle has that someone as sophisticated as Anton Moss could give her romance and the possibility for true love. And she's so wrapped up in the romantic fantasies from Anton's books that she keeps perpetually chasing him, only to be disappointed by the reality. However, while Isabelle waits for Anton, her bubby has other plans, and she sets a meeting with Hannah Mandelbaum.
Don't scream.
Why should I scream?
Hannah's coming.
Who?
Hannah, she's coming over.
Why should I scream?
That's Hannah. Hannah the Shadchen.
You might be familiar with the role of a Shadchen, a matchmaker, from the musical Fiddler on the Roof, where in that story, Yenta, the matchmaker, comes to Tevye's house to let them know that she's found a match for their daughter Tzeitel with the butcher Laser Wolf. The way that the system worked was that a Shadchen would keep in touch with many families and keep tabs on all of their children, and when they would become of age, a Shadchen would recommend to the parents of two families that their children meet. And if the parents agree, then the couple would meet and get engaged. And this is how it worked in the shtetl, and a version of this system is still practiced in some Orthodox communities like Hasidish and Yeshivish. The seed for this comes from the story of Adam and Eve, actually, from the verse in Genesis which says, Lo tov hies ha'adam levadai, esolai ezer kenegdai, which means it's not good for a person to be alone. God created them a counterpart, a spouse. And in religious communities, like in the shtetl, this came to mean that there is a religious obligation to get married, and so the Shadchen helps facilitate that to make sure that you fulfill that obligation. But the Bubby also quotes a similar idea from this verse, that it's not good to be alone, although for her, I don't think it's so much a religious idea so much as it's like a Yiddish folk wisdom.
A dog should live alone, not people. A dog.
Another element at play here is the social pressure to get married, which also has its roots in religious practice. There's actually a scene in the movie where Isabelle goes to a bris of her high school classmate's son. And there's this passage which is recited at the bris, Kishem shenichnas labris, kach l'Torah l'chuppah l'maisim tovim. Just as this baby has entered into the bris, they should also enter into other moments like the study of Torah, good deeds, and marriage. In fact, you can see it illustrated here in this design from Germany in the 1800s. And part of the meaning of this passage is that just as a bris is life cycle milestone, just like a bar bat mitzvah, marriage is as well. And so you can see this moment at the bris where this line is recited, and you can see the social weight that this blessing has, even though the people reciting it aren't all that religious.
Of the study of the Torah. Of the study of the Torah. The doing of good deeds. The doing of good deeds. And marital happiness. And marital happiness.
Right.
But getting back to the park, as we know, Isabelle is interested in a romance with Anton, and most certainly not from an old-fashioned Shadchen.
Don't scream.
Why should I scream?
Hannah's coming.
Who?
Hannah, she's coming over.
Why should I scream?
That's Hannah. Hannah the Shadchen.
You made an appointment with a marriage broker? Bubby, this is not the way I live. This is 100 years ago.
It's interesting that Isabelle, who for the most part is a very reserved and even-keeled person, is quite vociferous in her resistance to being set up by the Shadchen. I think the reason why she gets so animated by this is because it's such a visceral moment, and we can see this come up over and over in many Jewish stories and many movies. For example, in Fiddler on the Roof, the daughter Tzeitel that gets set up by the matchmaker pleads with her father Tevye not to go through with the match and let her marry someone for love and not just for financial stability. Another example of this can be seen in the Hallmark movie called Loving Leia, which I've mentioned a few times on this channel before. In that story, after her husband passes away, she finds out that her mother has set up an appointment with the Shadchen.
Have you seen Mama yet?
Why?
She's meeting with Mrs. Finkelman.
She called the matchmaker? What is her hurry?
And another example I'll give you is from a short film that I saw a couple of years ago called Shidduch Crisis. And in that story, there's also a moment where the mother calls the Shadchen against her daughter's wishes.
I told you I'm not interested in dating right now. Why is Devora here? I just want you to listen. She has a really good idea. Ma, we spoke about this.
And part of the resistance that all of these stories share in common is this idea that what the Shadchen is offering isn't a chance at true love, but ultimately it's stability, usually financial. And Isabelle intuits this in her first meeting with the Shadchen in the park. And later on, there's a moment where Mrs. Mandelbaum herself actually says the quiet part out loud.
Listen to me, my dear girl. Take some advice from someone who knows. Love comes and goes very quickly, but a good business, a nice home, a man with a job who's good and kind, this is what counts. Listen, I know what I'm talking about. I know about life from inside out.
Despite all of this resistance, the bubby insists that Isabelle meet with Sam.
Do you listen to me? Loneliness is a very lousy case.
The thing is that Sam isn't the marriage broker. He's a different person who is also looking for love. The thing is that because of all these different layers, the marriage broker, the grandmother, the social pressure, Isabelle isn't really able to see Sam. She sees all of this distraction in between them, and so she initially rejects him.
You feel funny, huh?
This isn't the way I live. This isn't the way I do things.
How do you live?
Well, for one thing, I don't live down here. I live uptown.
Is that right?
A million miles from here.
Although she was asked how she lives, she says uptown because that is the answer to that question. It represents her desire to find love on her own terms, independently, while downtown represents social pressure rooted in tradition, which does feel a million miles away to her. We can actually see this visually portrayed in the movie as well. When Isabelle goes to the subway in her neighborhood uptown, there's a guy outside selling books, and she spots one of Anton Maas's novels. And when she comes out of the subway in the Lower East Side, you can see a couple of Hasidic kids sitting in front of the station just chilling.
This isn't your style.
This isn't my style.
Sometimes you can change your style.
During this moment in their initial encounter, Sam shares a story with Isabelle, which he hopes will differentiate him from the marriage broker and show that he isn't as old-fashioned as she may think. And what's more, there might actually be a chance here for true love.
I have this friend, Harry Shipman. Shipman Imports. Locks, caviar, fancy stuff. For years, he used to wear this little brown cap, the brim pulled down. You wondered how he could see. One day he's crossing Delancey, this big wind comes, poof, it's gone. He runs after it, but a truck gets there before he does. He comes into me crying, he feels so bad. Harry, I said, here, take $5, go across to Finkel and buy yourself a new one. But do me a favor, forget the brown cap. He goes, he comes back an hour later, he's a new man. A gray felt Stetson, a beauty. The next day, he makes an engagement. Between you and me, he must have given Finkel some Nova on the side. There was no $5 hat.
At first, the point of the story is kind of lost on Isabelle, and what she hears is just more confirmation that to Sam, this is like a transaction in the village square. Man trades locks for a Stetson, gets a bride and a bargain. How romantic.
Man trades some locks for Stetson and gets a bride in the bargain. Very romantic.
Oh, he had his eye on her for a long time, but she couldn't see him. That little brown cap. She couldn't see his eyes.
And in this moment where Sam and Isabelle lock eyes for the first time, something shifts, and we as the viewers can feel it also. And that's when we realize that this isn't just a transaction to Sam. But despite that, Isabelle rejects going on a date with Sam, but as he leaves, he reiterates the point of his story.
You should try a new hat sometime, Isabelle. Might look good on you.
And he later on sends Isabelle a gift of a hat, which not only is a reminder of the point of his story that perhaps she can find love downtown and not just uptown, but the very act of sending the hat as a gift, coy and all, turns out to be romantic.
Bubby, I'm being rude.
Wood? What is wood?
Wood? What is wood? Eventually, Sam and Isabelle do end up going out to dinner, but it's really just so Isabelle can pull off this elaborate ruse where she passes him off to her friend. But it's during that dinner where Isabelle realizes that she may have judged Sam wrongly, that perhaps there's more to him than just the system which introduced them.
It was an awkward situation. Mrs. Mandelbaum setting it up like that. I should have spoken to you on my own the first time I saw you.
When was that?
The first time? About 3.5 years ago, I think.
Where?
In the neighborhood, on the benches with your bubby, around.
Really?
Then one day, Mrs. Mandelbaum comes by the store and does her usual spiel. Shows me her pictures, tells her lies. This one's 18, a scholar. This one's 22, a beauty. It's like this little ritual we have. She has a business, and I respect that. I'm a bachelor. She can't help herself.
Wait a minute. You mean you didn't hire her?
No. But on this particular day, she pulled this from her bag.
No.
And I said, yes, Mrs. Mandelbaum, this one I'll meet.
For the first time in this movie, we see Isabelle have a genuinely romantic moment, not with Anton, the one who writes about this in his elaborate fictions, but with Sam, a down-to-earth pickle guy, which is something that Isabelle completely does not expect. In many stories, particularly in Jewish ones, there's this theme of being between two worlds or being pulled into two different directions, like tradition and modernity. And it's a topic that we've discussed here on the channel, and you could see it at play in this movie as well, where after the dinner with Sam, Isabelle, who considers herself thoroughly modern, begins to be pulled towards this man who was introduced to her by tradition.
I thought you wanted to get rid of this guy. I do. I'm just interested.
But there's one key difference between the concept of tradition versus modernity and this movie, and that is those are ideas, but in this case, we're talking about people.
Someone who doesn't want to see someone, you're seeing an awful lot of me.
There's an old Yiddish expression which I think perfectly addresses this dilemma, which was actually captured in the movie Hester Street. With one tuchis, you can't dance at two weddings.
With one tuchis, you can't dance at two weddings.
In that movie, that line was regarding the husband Jake, who was pulled between his modern mistress and his traditionalist wife. I want to take that line and apply it to this movie where, like Jake, Isabelle must choose where she's going to dance.
I can't tonight.
Let him wait. They love to be kept waiting.
In the end, her illusion of a romance with Anton crashes once she realizes that his romantic gestures towards her are only so that she will become his new assistant and do all of his dirty work. And then she rushes downtown to meet with Sam at her bubby's apartment, where she's running late for a date with him. And she comes into the apartment and she sees her bubby sleeping, and Sam is nowhere to be seen. Isabelle sits down and tears up for a moment. And we could see her realize that she was pursuing someone who, in her own words, was deceptively accessible, only to lose someone who was genuinely interested in her and actually romantic. What's interesting is that earlier in the movie, there's this scene where Isabelle is in this hot dog shop, and this woman walks in and sings a song called Some Enchanted Evening.
You'll see a stranger across a crowded room, and somehow you'll know even then. You'll know you will see him again and again. Once you have found him, never let him go.
In that moment, we can see how deeply that song resonates with Isabelle, where at that point in the story, in her mind, this song is referring to Anton, who is her stranger across the room, like we saw in the opening. But at this point, while she's sitting alone in her bubby's apartment, she fears that she may have reached the second part of the song.
Once you have found him, never let him go.
She found the right one, but she let him go. However, her bubby once again had other plans, and while the bubby and Sam were waiting for Isabelle to show up in the apartment, she shares the following wisdom with Sam.
When I was a girl, such a thing to look at. A fella named Chaya, Taylor's son, comes to me. Ida, he says, look at me. I'm falling into pieces. My life is over if you won't take me. I'll walk into the East River, and this will be my grave. He was a clean little fellow with spectacles and a good family. But he didn't mean nothing to me. So he sits himself down in Aunt Bessie's kitchen, and he says, Ida, I won't move. I won't crawl an inch until you say yes. I'm stuck here like a piece of furniture.
So, what did you do?
I married him. What else? And in the end, it was good. If somebody wanted me so much that he was ready to make a fool of himself, it was easy to see that he'd be good to me.
To Sam, the moral of the story from the bubby, which is I'm stuck here like a piece of furniture, has a very similar meaning to the line in the song, once you found him, never let him go. Except that this time, instead of the room being a bookstore uptown, it's actually a downtown kitchen.
Go ahead, say it. Schmuck, what are you still doing here?
And ultimately, Sam is able to win over to woo Isabelle by telling her that he made a blessing in anticipation of their date using a traditionalist concept in a romantic way.
You don't know how nuts I was about tonight. I was off the ground. Nobody could talk to me. I made wrong change all day. I was so happy I was going to see you tonight. I made a special brucha for the occasion. I said the prayer for the planting of new trees. Don't ask me why.
But unlike in Joe Silver's other film, Hester Street, where the characters start together and then drift apart, in Crossing Delancey, the characters start in two different worlds and come together. And although we don't know what ends up happening with Sam and Isabelle, do they actually get married? Do they live happily ever after? The point that this movie makes is just to raise the question of, is it possible to get a new hat? Is it possible to get a change in perspective and to find love in unexpected places?
You'll bring him with you next time you come?
I'll bring him with me next time I come.
Come, children, come. Let's put the bobby to bed.
If you're still watching, I want to thank you for being here to the end of this episode of Yiddishe Kino Club. Check out other episodes if you'd like breakdowns of Jewish movies, especially the ones we mentioned in this film, like Hester Street, American Pickle. And I also talked about Loving Leia in a video about my experience with Orthodox Judaism. We also mentioned briefly how early showbiz was influenced by the Yiddish stage from the Lower East Side, and you can also learn more about that in my conversation with Bob Terry from Old Jewish Men. If you want to learn more about the shidduch system, the way it's practiced in Hasidic and Yeshivish communities, then you can check out this breakdown on Dar Yesharim and genetic screening. And in the meantime, if you're interested in Jewish history, culture, and art, then you, my friend, you're in the right place. My name is David, and welcome to Yiddishkeit.